How did you prove your parents treated you like an employee instead of their child? The invoice sat on my desk for 3 days before I had the courage to print it. Itemized, detailed, formatted like the billing statements my father sent his consulting clients every month. Except this one was addressed to Robert and Diana Kellerman, my parents, for services rendered by their son from ages 14 to 18. 4 years of labor calculated at market rates with timestamps, task descriptions, and professional categories. Childcare services, household management, administrative support, groundskeeping, and event coordination. The total came to $147,000. I was 17 years old, and I'd finally quantified exactly what they owed me for treating me like staff instead of their son. The realization didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated slowly, building through 1,000 small moments that individually seemed reasonable but collectively formed an undeniable pattern. It started the summer I turned 14 when my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and explained their new family efficiency model. My father called it optimization. My mother called it teaching responsibility. I called it the beginning of the end of my childhood. They'd just had my twin siblings, Audrey and Nathan, and needed help managing the household while building their consulting firm. What they described sounded temporary and collaborative. What it became was permanent and exploitative. The efficiency model assigned me specific duties with expected completion standards and performance metrics. Not chores, duties. Not helping out, performance metrics. My father created a spreadsheet tracking my task completion rates, time efficiency, and quality scores based on their inspections. Every Sunday evening, we held performance reviews where they assessed my work week and identified areas for improvement. I was 14 years old getting quarterly evaluations on how well I managed their household while they built a business, teaching other companies how to maximize employee productivity. The irony was lost on them completely. My duties started reasonably. Wake the twins at 6:30, prepare their bottles, change diapers, keep them entertained while my parents worked from home. Clean the kitchen after meals, maintain the family calendar, handle grocery lists and household inventory. Mow the lawn weekly, maintain the garden, organize the garage seasonally. Maybe 20 hours weekly on top of school and homework. But reasonable became excessive when their business took off and my responsibilities expanded without discussion or compensation. By 15, I was doing 35 hours weekly. By 16, it was 50. By 17, I was working more hours managing their household than they spent building the consulting firm that made them wealthy. The twins became my primary responsibility entirely. I got them ready every morning, dressed them, fed them, packed their bags for daycare. I picked them up every afternoon, brought them home, supervised homework, prepared dinner, managed bath time, read bedtime stories, tucked them in. My parents worked late most nights, sometimes not coming home until 9 or 10, long after the twins were asleep. On weekends, they had networking events, client meetings, or conference calls. I had the twins. Always. Every weekend, every evening, every school break. I knew their teachers better than my parents did. I knew their favorite foods, their fears, their friends, their personalities. I was raising my siblings while my parents built their careers. The household management expanded too. I didn't just clean anymore, I managed. I coordinated service appointments for appliances, scheduled contractors for repairs, handled communications with landscapers and housekeepers, maintained household supply inventories, processed bills and receipts for their accountant. My mother handed me the household credit card when I turned 16 and told me to handle all domestic purchasing decisions. She said it would teach me financial responsibility. What it taught me was that I was running their home while they pretended to be present parents. I was their household manager with none of the authority and none of the compensation. The breaking point should have come earlier, but I'd normalized the exploitation. When you're inside something toxic, you lose perspective on how abnormal it's become. What finally opened my eyes was my guidance counselor, Mrs. Liu, asking about my extracurricular activities for college applications. I told her I didn't have any. No sports, no clubs, no volunteer work. She asked how I spent my time outside school. I described my daily schedule without thinking about how it sounded. She went very quiet, then asked how many hours weekly I spent on these responsibilities. I calculated roughly 50 to 60 hours, maybe more during summer. She asked if my parents paid me. I laughed. Paid me? They were teaching me responsibility, preparing me for adulthood, giving me valuable life skills. Her expression told me everything before she said a word. That's not parenting, she said quietly. That's employment without compensation. You're describing a full-time job managing a household and raising children while attending high school. Your parents aren't teaching you responsibility. They're exploiting your labor. The word exploitation hit differently than I expected. I'd heard it before in history class, economics discussions, but never applied to my life. She asked if I'd ever refused these duties. I said no, consequences weren't worth it. She asked what consequences. I told her about the performance reviews, the efficiency metrics, the constant feedback on my failures to meet their standards. She asked if they praised me when I succeeded. I realized they didn't. Success was expected. Failure was corrected. Like an employee, not a son. That conversation planted something dark and determined in my mind. I started paying attention to how my parents treated me versus how my friends' parents treated them. Normal parents asked about school, interests, feelings. Mine asked if I'd scheduled the HVAC maintenance and why the twins' daycare reported Nathan had the wrong lunch. Normal parents gave allowances for basic chores. Mine gave me access to the household credit card for purchasing supplies I needed to complete my duties. Normal parents attended their kids' school events. Mine sent me to the twins' preschool performances while they worked. I wasn't their child. I was their most cost-effective employee. I started documenting everything systematically. I created a detailed log tracking every task, every hour, every responsibility they assigned. I categorized my work into professional service categories and researched market rates. Childcare providers in our area charged $25 hourly. Household managers earned $28. Administrative assistants made $22. Groundskeepers charged $30 for lawn maintenance. Event coordinators billed $40 hourly. I tracked 4 months of work meticulously, logged every minute, categorized every task, calculated every cost. The numbers were staggering. In just 4 months, I'd provided $62,000 worth of professional services to my parents completely free. I expanded my research backward, reconstructing my duties from ages 14 to present. I found old calendar entries, text messages assigning tasks, photos of completed projects they'd required. I built a comprehensive record of 4 years of unpaid labor. I calculated conservatively, using lower-end hourly rates, excluding time that could arguably be normal teenage contributions. Even being generous toward them, the total was devastating. $147,000 in professional services I'd provided to my parents while they built a consulting firm now worth millions. They'd literally built their wealth on my unpaid labor while teaching Fortune 500 companies about employee satisfaction and workplace ethics. The invoice took me 2 weeks to create. I used their business template, the same format they sent clients. Professional, detailed, impossible to dismiss as teenage dramatics. I itemized every category with hourly breakdowns and service descriptions. Childcare services, 4,200 hours at $25 hourly. Household management, 3,800 hours at $28 hourly. Administrative support, 2,600 hours at $22 hourly. Groundskeeping, 1,200 hours at $30 hourly. Event coordination, 800 hours at $40 hourly. Each category included specific tasks and dates. The documentation was irrefutable. I printed the invoice on a Tuesday afternoon while they were both at a client meeting. I placed it in their home office, centered on my father's desk, where he'd see it immediately upon return. Then I went to pick up the twins from daycare, prepared their dinner, supervised homework, managed bath time, and put them to bed. Normal Tuesday evening, normal duties. Except I'd just sent my parents a bill for $147,000 for raising their children and managing their household while they pursued professional success. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I couldn't continue pretending this was normal parenting. They'd trained me well. I'd learned to document everything, maintain detailed records, and present professional billing for services rendered. My father found the invoice around 8:30 that evening. I heard him come home, heard his office door close, heard the long silence that meant he was reading. Then I heard him call my mother. More silence. Then they called me downstairs. I walked into the office with my stomach churning, but my face calm. Years of performance reviews had taught me to control my expressions during evaluations. My father held the invoice, his face unreadable. My mother stood beside him, arms crossed. They looked at me the way they probably looked at employees who'd made significant errors, disappointed, confused, concerned about what this meant for productivity. "What is this?" my father asked, his voice carefully controlled. I said it was exactly what it appeared to be, an itemized invoice for services I'd provided to them over the past 4 years. He asked if this was some kind of joke. I said no. It was a professional billing statement calculated at market rates for the work I performed. My mother asked where this was coming from. I told her it came from Mrs. Liu, pointing out that managing a household and raising children while attending high school full-time wasn't teaching responsibility. It was unpaid employment. My father's expression shifted from confusion to something colder. He said I was being ridiculous, that families help each other, that they'd given me valuable experience and life skills. I asked if his consulting clients would accept valuable experience instead of payment for their work. The silence that followed was absolute. I continued before they could respond. I told them I'd researched extensively. Professional childcare providers earned $25 hourly. I'd provided over 4,000 hours of childcare, often sole supervision overnight when they traveled for business. Household managers earned $28 hourly. I'd managed every aspect of their home, from maintenance scheduling to supply inventory, for 4 years. Administrative assistants earned $22 hourly. I'd processed their household finances, coordinated appointments, managed communications. The market rates were conservative. The documentation was thorough. The total was what they owed me if I'd been any other person providing these services. But I wasn't any other person. I was their son, which apparently meant my labor was free. My mother tried the emotional approach. She said she was hurt I'd reduced family contributions to financial transactions, that we worked together as a unit supporting each other. I asked what support I received in return. She listed providing housing, food, education. I pointed out those were legal requirements, not generous gifts. Parents were obligated to house and feed their minor children. Providing mandatory care didn't justify extracting full-time unpaid labor. My father switched tactics. He said if I wanted to discuss compensation, we could negotiate a reasonable allowance for helping with the twins. I asked what he considered reasonable. He suggested $50 weekly. I calculated quickly. $50 weekly was $2,600 annually. I was providing over $36,000 worth of services annually at minimum. He was offering 7% of market value. I told them I didn't want their money. I wanted them to acknowledge what they'd done, to admit they'd treated me like an employee instead of their child, to recognize they'd built their successful consulting firm teaching companies about workplace ethics while systematically exploiting their own son's labor at home. The invoice wasn't a real bill. It was proof they couldn't dismiss or rationalize away, proof that what they'd normalized was actually systematic exploitation, proof that I'd finally recognized what they were doing. My father's face went red. He said I was being dramatic and disrespectful, that I should be grateful for the opportunities they'd provided. I asked what opportunities? The opportunity to raise my siblings while missing my entire high school experience? The opportunity to manage their household while they traveled for business? The opportunity to sacrifice my education and future so they could build their careers? My mother started crying, real tears or manipulative ones. I couldn't tell anymore. She said they'd done their best, that building the business required sacrifices from everyone, that they'd always intended to give me a good life. I said they'd given themselves a good life by using me as free labor. The consulting firm was thriving. They drove expensive cars, lived in a beautiful home, took client trips to resort destinations. Meanwhile, I had no college savings, no time for applications, no extracurriculars to list, and no childhood to look back on. I'd spent 4 years as their household manager and the twins' primary caregiver while they pretended to be present parents. The twins called them mom and dad, but looked to me for everything that mattered. I knew their school schedules, their dietary restrictions, their medication dosages, their bedtime routines. My parents knew their business metrics. My father stood and said this conversation was over, that I would continue my responsibilities as expected and we'd discuss my attitude problem when I'd calm down. I said no, I wouldn't. He asked what I meant. I told him I was done. Done managing their household, done raising their children, done providing free professional services while they exploited my labor. He said I'd do as I was told while living under their roof. I said that was exactly the problem. They treated me like an employee but claimed parental authority when I challenged them. Employees could quit, children couldn't. They'd created a system where I had all the obligations of employment with none of the rights or compensation. Starting tomorrow, I'd provide only what was legally and morally expected of a 17-year-old son. Basic contributions to household cleanliness, nothing more. My mother asked what would happen to the twins. I said they'd have to figure it out, hire actual childcare, adjust their work schedules, be present parents. She said they couldn't afford full-time childcare. I pointed out they'd been getting full-time childcare free for 4 years. They could afford it. They just didn't want to pay for what I'd been providing for nothing. My father said if I refused my responsibilities, there would be consequences. I asked what consequences? Grounding? I didn't go anywhere because I was always home with the twins. Taking my phone? I only used it to coordinate their schedules. Taking my car? It was their car that I drove exclusively for their errands and the twins' transportation. Every privilege they could threaten was actually a tool they'd given me to better serve their needs. I had nothing they could take that would matter. I went to my room and locked the door. I heard them arguing downstairs for hours. My mother wanted to compromise. My father wanted to enforce discipline. Neither understood that I'd already made my decision. The next morning, I woke up at my normal time but didn't go to the twins' room. I got ready for school, made myself breakfast, and left. My phone started blowing up around 7:15. My mother texting frantically. The twins were awake and crying. She didn't know where their clothes were or what they ate for breakfast. She had a client call at 8 and couldn't find their daycare bags. I didn't respond. She could figure it out the same way millions of actual parents did every morning, by being a parent. At school, Mrs. Liu called me into her office. She asked if everything was okay. I told her about the invoice and my parents' response. She looked concerned, but not surprised. She said what I'd done took courage, but asked what my plan was now. I admitted I didn't have one beyond refusing to continue as their household manager. She asked where I'd go if they kicked me out. I hadn't thought that far ahead. She made a call, spoke quietly to someone, then told me her sister ran a youth shelter for teens in crisis situations. If I needed a place, I had options. That knowledge was armor. I wasn't trapped. I could leave if necessary. The house was chaos when I got home. My mother was still in her business clothes, looked exhausted and stressed. The twins were watching television surrounded by snack wrappers and toys. The kitchen was a disaster. She looked at me with something between fury and desperation and asked where I'd been. I said, school. She said she'd needed me home this morning. I said she had 2 parents living in the house. One of them should handle mornings. She said she'd had to cancel 2 client calls to deal with the twins. I said that was what working parents did. They adjusted their schedules for their children. She said I was being selfish and cruel. I said I was being a 17-year-old student instead of their unpaid household manager. Big difference. My father came home at his normal time, 6:30. The house was still chaotic. No dinner prepared, twins hungry and overtired, my mother overwhelmed. He looked around and said this was unacceptable. I asked what specifically was unacceptable. He gestured at everything. The mess, the disorder, the disruption to household function. I said this was what normal family evenings looked like when parents actually parented instead of outsourcing everything to their teenage son. He said we'd had a system that worked. I said we'd had a system that exploited me while they pretended it was teaching responsibility. Systems that depend on free labor from minors aren't working. They're abusive. The next 2 weeks were brutal. My parents scrambled to maintain their business commitments while actually caring for their children. My mother started leaving work at 3 to pick up the twins. My father began handling morning routines. They hired a housekeeping service for deep cleaning and a lawn care company for groundskeeping. They ordered takeout most nights because neither had time or energy to cook. They looked exhausted constantly. The twins were confused and acting out because their routines had been disrupted, and the person they depended on most had withdrawn. I felt guilty about the twins but maintained my boundaries. I'd help with homework if they asked. I'd play with them if they wanted, but I wouldn't manage their care. That was their parents' responsibility. My parents tried multiple approaches to restore the old system. Guilt, telling me the twins missed me and didn't understand why I'd abandoned them. Bribery, offering me the car title and increased allowance if I'd resume responsibilities. Threats, saying they'd cut off college funding if I didn't cooperate. Each approach revealed more about how they saw me, not as their son, but as a resource they'd lost access to. I documented every conversation, every manipulation attempt, every moment they prioritized their convenience over acknowledging what they'd done. The evidence accumulated into something undeniable. 3 weeks into my strike, my father came to my room late one evening. He looked older, tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He asked if we could talk. Really talk, not argue or negotiate. I said okay. He sat on my desk chair and was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd been thinking about what I'd said, about being treated like an employee instead of their son. He'd always thought he was teaching me responsibility and work ethic, giving me real-world experience managing complex systems. He'd been proud of how capable I'd become. He'd never considered that from my perspective. He was just exploiting my labor while calling it parenting. I waited for the but. It didn't come. He continued. He said he'd reviewed my invoice properly, checked my calculations against actual market rates. I'd been conservative. Actual costs would be higher. He'd also tracked their time over the past 3 weeks since I'd stopped managing the household. Combined, they'd spent 42 hours on childcare and household tasks they'd previously delegated to me. 42 hours weekly meant they'd been assigning me a full-time job on top of school. He'd built a career teaching companies not to overburden employees. Meanwhile, he'd been systematically overworking his own son and calling it character building. He was sorry, genuinely sorry. Not for needing help when the twins were born, but for never recognizing when temporary help became permanent exploitation. I asked if my mother felt the same way. He said they'd been discussing it extensively. She was struggling more with accepting they'd done something wrong because she'd always framed it as family working together. But she'd started recognizing the inequality too. How I'd had all the responsibilities while the twins had all the freedom. How they'd built successful careers while I'd sacrificed my high school experience. How they'd never once asked if I wanted this role or if the workload was sustainable. They'd just assumed I'd comply and built their lives around my unpaid labor. My father said he wanted to fix this but didn't know how. You couldn't undo 4 years of lost childhood. You couldn't repay time I'd never get back. I told him I didn't want repayment. I wanted acknowledgement. Genuine recognition that what they'd done was wrong and caused real harm. I wanted them to be actual parents to the twins instead of administrators managing from a distance. I wanted my senior year to be about my education and future, not their household management. And I wanted them to understand that calling something teaching responsibility didn't make it okay when it's actually systematic exploitation. He asked what I needed from them specifically. I said I needed them to tell the truth, to admit to themselves and others that they'd treated me like an employee instead of their son, that they'd built their consulting success by exploiting my unpaid labor at home, that I'd raised their children while they pretended to be present parents. He said okay, he'd do that. He asked if I'd written my college essays yet. I said no, I'd barely started applications because I'd had no time. He asked if I'd join him in his office tomorrow. There was something he wanted to show me. I agreed, uncertain what he meant but sensing something had shifted. The next evening, I found him at his computer working on a document. He turned the screen toward me. It was a formal statement, typed in business letter format, addressed to the admissions departments of the colleges I'd mentioned wanting to attend. It detailed exactly what he'd assigned me for the past 4 years, the professional equivalence of my duties, and his acknowledgement that he'd systematically exploited my labor while building his business. The letter continued. It explained that my lack of extracurriculars, leadership positions, and volunteer work wasn't due to lack of ambition or capability, but because I'd been working 50-plus hours weekly managing his household and raising my children while maintaining strong academic performance despite being systematically overburdened. It stated clearly that my college applications should be evaluated with understanding that I'd been doing work equivalent to multiple professional positions simultaneously while completing high school. He'd included his business credentials, his consulting firm's reputation, and his professional assessment of my capabilities based on the complex responsibilities he'd assigned me. It was thorough, honest, and devastating. A father admitting he'd exploited his son in a letter that would be read by admissions officers at top universities. I asked if he was actually going to send this. He said yes, if I wanted him to. He'd also prepared a second document, a formal apology to me, notarized and witnessed, admitting what he and my mother had done and acknowledging the harm they'd caused. Not for legal purposes, but because I deserved documentation that I wasn't crazy or ungrateful or selfish, that what I'd experienced was real and wrong and recognized. He'd also opened a college fund in my name and transferred $147,000 into it, the exact amount from my invoice. He said he couldn't give me back the time I'd lost, but he could ensure my future wasn't compromised by their past exploitation. I started crying. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that comes when something frozen inside you finally thaws. 4 years of being told I was learning responsibility, that I should be grateful, that families help each other. 4 years of believing maybe I was the problem for resenting my duties. And here was my father admitting I'd been right all along, that what I'd experienced was exploitation, that they'd treated me like an employee instead of their child, that I'd earned acknowledgement and restitution. He stood and hugged me, really hugged me, not the quick side hug we'd exchanged for years between task assignments. He said he'd spent his career teaching companies to value their employees. He'd failed to value his own son. That ended now. My mother joined the conversation the next day. She'd struggled more with accepting what they'd done because she genuinely believed they were teaching me valuable skills while managing a difficult situation. But my father had walked her through the documentation, the hours, the market value calculations. She'd finally recognized that if I'd been anyone else providing those services, she'd have called it exploitative employment. Her own son didn't deserve less protection than a stranger. She apologized, too, tears streaming down her face, admitting she'd prioritized her career over my childhood and justified it with convenient rationalizations about responsibility and family values. She said she'd failed me as a mother by being my manager instead. The family meeting we held that weekend included the twins, now 4 years old and old enough to understand some of what was happening. My parents explained that they'd been asking me to do too much grown-up work, that it wasn't fair, and that things would change. Nathan asked if I'd still play with them. I said yes, as their brother, not their caretaker. Audrey asked if Mommy and Daddy would pick them up from school now. My mother said yes, they would. The twins looked uncertain but accepting. They'd adjust. Kids were resilient when adults finally did the right thing. What damaged children wasn't change, but continued mistreatment disguised as normal family dynamics. My senior year transformed completely. My parents hired a part-time nanny to cover gaps in their schedules. They adjusted their work hours to be present for the twins. They started attending the twins' activities themselves instead of sending me as their representative. The house was messier than before, their stress levels higher, but the family felt more real, more honest. I focused on my applications, my essays, my future. Mrs. Liu helped me craft a personal statement about discovering self-worth isn't determined by productivity, about learning that being needed doesn't mean being valued, about understanding the difference between teaching responsibility and exploiting labor. My father sent his letter to every college I applied to, along with his recommendation letter. The combination was powerful. A successful consultant admitting he'd systematically overburdened his son while teaching Fortune 500 companies about employee welfare. Admissions officers responded to the honesty. I got into my top choice with a significant scholarship. The financial aid office noted that students who'd overcome systematic exploitation while maintaining academic excellence demonstrated exactly the resilience and character they valued. My exploitation became my most compelling achievement. The system was broken enough that surviving abuse qualified as accomplishment, but at least it opened doors. The notarized apology my father prepared became something I referenced when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I'd been too harsh or demanded too much or misunderstood their intentions. The document was proof I hadn't imagined the exploitation. Professional acknowledgement that what I'd experienced was real and harmful. Some people need therapy to process parental damage. I had a legally witnessed admission of guilt. It shouldn't have been necessary, but it was powerful. Validation in writing that my parents had failed me and recognized their failure. My relationship with my parents slowly rebuilt on more honest terms. They were careful now about requests, always asking rather than assigning, always respecting when I said no. The twins became their responsibility, their joy, their challenge. I watched them struggle with parenting the way most parents did and felt vindicated. This was what they'd avoided for 4 years by dumping it on me. This chaos, this exhaustion, this constant juggling of needs and schedules. They'd outsourced the hard parts of parenting to their teenage son while keeping the pleasant parts for themselves. Now they were experiencing the full reality of the choices they'd made when they had the twins. College started in September. I moved into my dorm with the college fund they'd provided sitting safely in my account. $147,000. Proof that my labor had value, proof that they acknowledged what they'd taken. I used some for tuition, some for expenses, and saved the rest. Money earned from exploitation felt tainted, but it also felt like justice. They'd profited from my unpaid work for years. Now I'd profit from their acknowledgement. The symmetry was satisfying even if nothing could restore what I'd lost. My roommate asked during move-in if I was close with my family. I said it was complicated. We'd been through something difficult, but we're working through it. He said families were always complicated. I agreed, but didn't elaborate. How do you explain that your parents treated you like an employee instead of their child? That you had to create a professional invoice to prove systematic exploitation? That sometimes the only way to fix broken family dynamics is burning them down and rebuilding from honest foundations? Some truths were too complex for casual conversation. Thanksgiving was the first test of our rebuilt relationship. I went home uncertain how it would feel being back in that house. My parents had changed things. My old bedroom was still mine, but they'd removed the desk where I'd spent countless hours doing homework between childcare and household management duties. They'd redecorated to make it feel less like the office it had become, and more like a space for me to relax. Small gesture, but it mattered. They were trying to see me as their son instead of their household manager. Dinner was different too. We all cooked together. My father handled the turkey. My mother managed sides. I helped the twins make decorations. Equal participation, equal value, equal respect. During dinner, my father made a toast. He thanked everyone for being there, for giving him and my mother a chance to be better parents, for teaching them that family means mutual support, not systematic exploitation. The twins looked confused. I explained it meant Mommy and Daddy were learning to be better at taking care of all of us. Nathan said they were doing a good job. Kids' forgiveness came easier than mine, but I was working toward it. The consulting firm thrived despite my parents' reduced hours. Turned out their success wasn't dependent on exploiting me. It was built on genuine expertise and strong client relationships. They'd just used me as a convenient solution to avoid adjusting their work-life balance. Now they'd adjusted and discovered they could be successful professionals and present parents simultaneously. It required sacrifice, but not from me anymore. From them. The people who'd chosen to have 4 children and build a business simultaneously. The adults who should have been making sacrifices all along instead of extracting them from their teenage son. My relationship with the twins improved too. Without the resentment of forced caregiving, I could enjoy being their brother. I came home some weekends and we played, did crafts, read stories. But I left when I wanted. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't their default caretaker. I was their brother who visited and chose to spend time with them. That choice made all the difference. Love given freely felt completely different from love extracted through expectation and obligation. They sensed the difference too. They stopped treating me like a parent figure and started treating me like a sibling. Age-appropriate, healthy, real. Spring semester, I took a sociology class on labor exploitation. We studied unpaid labor, systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations, and economic systems built on extracting value from those with less power. I wrote my term paper on domestic labor exploitation within families, using my own experience as a case study. My professor gave me an A and asked if I'd present it at the undergraduate research conference. I agreed. Standing in front of an audience explaining how families could systematically exploit their children's labor while maintaining plausible deniability through rhetoric about responsibility and family values felt powerful. Making the invisible visible. Naming what so many people experienced but couldn't articulate. After the presentation, 3 students approached me separately. Each described similar experiences. One had managed her family's business books from age 13. Another had been his disabled sibling's primary caretaker through high school. The third had run her family's household while her parents worked multiple jobs. All 3 had normalized their exploitation until someone pointed out that their situations weren't teaching responsibility, but extracting unsustainable labor from minors. We exchanged contact information and talked about creating a support group. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with your damage is make it visible for others who think they're alone. My parents attended my graduation 2 years later. They'd continued therapy, both individually and as a couple, working through why they'd thought systematic exploitation of their son was acceptable parenting. The therapist told them they'd replicated patterns from their own childhoods, where children were resources to be managed rather than people to be nurtured. Breaking generational cycles required active work and continued awareness. They were doing the work. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. They'd started a college fund for the twins that wouldn't require the twins to earn it through unpaid labor. They'd learned, finally, what being parents meant. During the graduation reception, my father pulled me aside. He said he'd been invited to speak at a consulting conference about workplace ethics. He was planning to discuss how ethical failures at work often mirror ethical failures at home, how he'd taught companies to value employees while systematically exploiting his own son. He wanted my permission to tell our story publicly. I said yes. Institutional change happened when people in power admitted their failures and modeled better behavior. If he could prevent other parents from making his mistakes, our damage would serve a purpose beyond our family. He thanked me and said he'd send me his speech draft for approval. Partnership, not management. Respect, not obligation. The twins were 6 now, thriving in first grade, well-adjusted despite their chaotic early years. They had no memory of me as their primary caretaker. To them, I was always their big brother who lived at college and came home for visits. My parents were mom and dad who picked them up from school, attended their activities, tucked them in at night. The way it should have been from the beginning. The way it would have been if my parents had made different choices. But they'd learned, and the twins benefited from their parents' hard-won wisdom. Break the cycle before the next generation pays the price. I graduated with honors and a job offer at a nonprofit advocating for children's rights. Working to prevent the exploitation I'd experienced felt purposeful. My parents attended the celebration dinner looking proud but also sobered. They'd raised a son who'd succeeded despite their failures, not because of their parenting. They knew the difference now. I'd taught them by refusing to accept their definition of family responsibility. Sometimes, children teach parents what ethical behavior looks like by refusing to enable continued exploitation. Sometimes love means saying no and meaning it. The invoice still sits in a file folder in my apartment. $147,000 itemized across 4 years of unpaid labor. Proof that what I experienced was real, quantifiable, and wrong. Proof that I was never dramatic or ungrateful or selfish for refusing to continue. Proof that treating your child like an employee instead of a son has calculable costs that eventually come due. My parents paid those costs financially and emotionally. I paid them in lost childhood and learned boundaries. We're all still paying them in complex relationships that require active work to maintain. But at least now we're paying honestly, with full acknowledgement of what was taken and what can never be restored. Sometimes that's the best justice available, bittersweet and incomplete, but real. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.